Good evening and welcome to a special Board of Ed meeting. This is Monday, June 15th. We have called this special meeting for the Board of Ed together tonight in order to continue to get updates from Dr. Freeman on school planning around COVID-19 issues, as well as to have a discussion about the process for addressing concerns we've heard about race and racism instruction and the Guilford High School mascot. At the end of this meeting, there will be an executive session that we will hold. So that is the full agenda for the evening. So I think I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Freeman because the first item on the agenda is COVID-19 updates.
Thank you very much. So along those lines, the trend numbers in Connecticut continue to look very positive. In the governor's call last week, he continued to let us know about the reopening plans statewide that are going on. Locally, what this means for us most immediately is that we are looking forward to a graduation on Wednesday evening here. We have final plans for that graduation. We are excited about the procession that will lead our graduating seniors from Guilford High School to the fairgrounds, and for the event that will take place at the fairgrounds itself. We're very happy that we have a graduation that both will be safe and healthy, and that will have live elements and allow the students to walk across the stage. We continue to shift our focus now to the reopening of schools next year. I do want to let the board know that at this point, we do not have guidance for reopening from the State Department of Education. There was a meeting of a number of superintendents with the Commissioner of Education last week. I appreciated the fact that Dr. Cardonia did a lot of listening during that meeting, was asking a lot of questions, was concerned about how we're planning for reopening, what concerns we have in the districts about reopening. We are hopeful that we will have guidance coming out of the State Department possibly within the next 2 weeks. Again, I don't envy those people in Hartford who are working with balancing changing metrics around the spread of COVID and pressures from communities demanding to know what September will look like, but we'll continue to monitor that. In the interim, we continue to plan as best we can for an opening in September. And at this point, that includes trying really hard to listen and to listen thoughtfully and carefully. We today relaunched the parent satisfaction survey that we conducted, I think it was 4 or 5 weeks ago. We want to take a second measure now that we've been in distance learning for a longer period of time. We want to hear from parents who are supporting their students of all ages at home about what worked and what we're seeing as challenges during distance learning. Additionally, Dr. Crystal and I are scheduling a series of focus group meetings. We'll be meeting with parents in 3 different focus groups: elementary age parents, middle school aged parents, and high school aged parents, to talk with them about the experience and to hear the stories, to add some anecdote and some depth to what we see in the survey. Additionally, we'll be scheduling a focus group with teachers from across all of the grade levels, and we'll be scheduling a focus group with students, probably focusing on middle and high school age students, to hear from them about their experiences and both what worked and what they saw as challenges in the distance learning model. And the leadership team in district continues to work with different groups that are working on reopening. We're working with a regional group through the Learn cohort. We are working with a statewide group through the Connecticut Center for School Change. And as I mentioned, I continue to monitor the work at the CAPS level, working closely with the State Department. As a leadership team, we're beginning to model out a variety of options, including a significant, if not a full return to in-person schooling, though with social distancing protections in place, a partial return, a return to school that might include only loading schools or classrooms to 50% capacity and hybridizing that with some continuation of distance learning. And then the possibility of needing to open in September, maintaining a distance learning format. And again, at this point, we're continuing to look at logistics and details and instructional priorities and model out all three of those options, including the fallback that we open in person and have to return to distance learning, or that we open in distance learning but have the opportunity to move to in-person at a future time. So again, we're continuing to work on all of those until we have some guidance that sharpens that focus. Additionally, we will be wrapping classes here at all grade levels on this Wednesday, the 17th, and there will be a little bit of downtime before we begin summer instruction that will begin on July 6th. Summer instruction will include some limited in-person instruction, but will continue to be primarily a distance learning structure format as we move into these summer months. Mentioned to you at our last meeting that we're excited and should have invitations out to the community soon for students grades K through 8 to enlist in the summer learning pathways that we're very excited about. That tends to be the big COVID update. I will have more to share and probably a lengthier report when we talk more about communications around race and racism and the work that we're looking to do moving forward around equity in the school district. But thought I'd pause here if there's any questions about graduation, summer school, or the reopening work that's continuing at this point.
Well, regarding the reopening, I know it's early, right? So
yep.
My concern is, let's just say we are fortunate enough to be able to open 100% in September. What thought is being given or concern being given to families that may not feel comfortable attending, and staff for that reason
yep.
too?
So that was a large part of the conversation with the commissioner. To some degree, that is going to first be driven by what kinds of flexibilities the State Department builds into any options or guidance that they offer. For instance, in the past, school meant, the 180 school days that we were required to achieve by definition meant in-person school days. And so the first thing we need to wait for would be whether or not we will be given the opportunity or the option to afford an alternate path. Part of what we're modeling out as a leadership team, and in fact, Mr. Bowden and I were talking about this earlier today, what would that look like if we return to school at 100% or close to 100% capacity, and there's some percentage of the population, 2%, 5%, that aren't comfortable coming back? What could a distance learning option look like, and what logistics need to be addressed to staff an option at the middle level, elementary level, and high school level? And that could and probably will look very different at each of those levels. First, we need the rules from the State Department. We will need to think about what we want that instructional model to look like. We will have to think through contractual and labor, right? Do we ask one teacher at first grade, second grade, K through 4 to stay at home and offer a distance option? We will have to at some point begin asking that question of the parent community. Lori Hahn and I talked at length about including that question on the survey that's going out to the parent population again today, but I didn't feel that we were ready to give everybody a fair set of details. We don't know if we'll be coming back at full capacity, half capacity, and if we do come back, what kinds of guidelines will we be putting in place? Will it include will students be coming to school but not passing in the halls? Will students be attending classrooms but not going to large-scale lunches? So we felt that saying, if schools open in September, would you be comfortable sending your child back, wasn't enough detail enough to allow somebody to answer that question knowledgeably. We're hoping that we can answer that question in 2 weeks and begin to shape that out. So again, it's one of the it's one of the scenarios we're planning for, but we don't know exactly what it will look like. We might have 1% of our students who remain home. We might have something smaller than that. We'll wait and follow the state's guidance. It's a good question. I wish I had a better answer.
Well, I would say that, we're following the right steps, and, kudos to the administration for planning for all of the options. And I know it's super frustrating to parents, including myself, to figure out what it's going to look like in the fall. But I think it's also good to remind that things are changing every day, and to make a decision too early would be hasty, because we don't know what's going to happen, positive or negative. Hopefully more positive. Not positive cases, positive news.
Right. Right.
And so I think, I would encourage parents to, be flexible about not pinning us to a date, because I think that the longer we can go, the better chance we have of, a better option.
And that's exactly what we're hearing out of Hartford. They have learned from graduation that they put out a series of really strict guidelines. Districts planned to those guidelines, and then they started loosening those guidelines. And so that's just for a one evening event, and it created a lot of consternation around the state. To plan reopening now and then have the expectations change would be difficult. And so, yes, I understand why everybody's hesitating. I also understand the frustration. I'm beginning to receive queries from parents wanting to know what September is going to look like, and I'm just unable to answer those questions right now, and just asking for more patience. What I do want to give the board and the community another heads up related to, however, is the calendar. It is likely that next Monday I'll be asking you to add an item to your agenda. One thing that we do know is that there will be a priority placed on professional learning and professional development. The calendar that you approved currently has 5 professional development days, 3 of which are front loaded, and there's one in November on election day, and then there's one that is very deep in the year in March. I think we're going to be bringing you a calendar proposal next week that will front load 4 of the 5 days, taking the March day out and moving it up to before the first day that students return, so that we've got 1 additional day to work with teachers. Obviously, we'll be working on whatever instructional components need to be in place to support whatever structure we open up with. But our next conversation is going to have us talking about supporting students and making sure that we're culturally responsive and addressing issues of race and racism in the system. And that's going to require some time as well. So we will likely be bringing you that whatever next year looks like. There's going to be a premium on professional development, and so front loading it seems to make sense. I don't believe that we can afford to move the day in November. The November day lands on election day. If schools are open in any capacity, we are not going to want to have the public in voting and students in school at the same time, and so we're going to need to hold that day there. And I'm sure however we open, there's going to be some lessons learned in those first 8 weeks, and November is a very good time to be able to work on adjustments and supports that need to be put in place. So if we've posted the agenda, I don't know if we got the calendar on there, but we'll be looking to bring that to you next week.
Other questions, thoughts, discussion on?
Just real quick, Paul, I just wanted to, if you could clarify for those listening, when you talk about the summer program, that there's going to be, distance learning enrichment opportunities just for any student K through 8, or are they specifically for just those students who have been designated in need of the summer learning program?
We're hoping to be able to put an invitation out in the next several days that will be out to all students K through 8. And now we don't know if there's going to be so much interest that we end up having to cap that. This is new for us. We've never offered this kind of invitational distance opportunity. So right now we are considering an invitation that will go out to all. We have worked on budgeting around it, and we're hopeful that we could offer there's going to be 8 different modules, and we're thinking that we may be able to staff as many as 2 in each case if the demand is there. But if there's a really high demand, it may end up having to be a capped number of students. But right now it will be an invitation to all that we're planning. And these would be 4-week inquiry-based, project-based opportunities where we're hoping to continue to keep students engaged and provide content for them. They will be interdisciplinary, where they're working across different subjects. So we know that they will be engaging and fun and valuable to the students, but we're also looking to refine what we've learned about distance learning from these past 12 weeks and looking forward into next year. So it's an opportunity to do some staff development, and it's also an opportunity to keep a certain number of kids engaged and working if there's interest. And so we'll be able to report back to you better after we've put that invitation out and see what kind of response we get.
Great, thank you.
Paul,
I also did want to note for the community, oh, I'm sorry, Joe?
Paul, what
Go ahead.
percentage of our teachers are 60 years old or older?
Approximately 14% fall into that age bracket.
So if people are worried, older people are worried about the virus, that's not an insignificant number of teachers.
No, but we're also working closely with, again, with the state, but also with our labor attorney, because there have been some very clear guidelines that have been established around exceptions. So when school does open, there is some guidance from FMLA and from other, so we do need to, I mean, we're going to be counting on our staff coming back and supporting our students if we have a full return. However, when we think about whether or not we offer a hybrid or whether some percentage of the students choose to stay at home, that may afford us an opportunity to pair students who are feeling uncomfortable returning to the school with staff members who would be more comfortable remaining in a distance learning model. But again, a lot of that is it's gonna rely on how the state counts those 180 days and whether we'll have an opportunity to offer options or whether we'll be expected to have 180 in-person school days for 100% of our students. We'll be waiting on guidance from Hartford there.
Thank you.
Paul, I had a question. If we do end up doing some distance learning next year or full distance learning, you've talked about the challenges that the teachers have faced with really no preparation, this in March to do this. Is there going to be an opportunity this summer or through the professional development before you open up the school for the teachers to get up to speed? Or to help them, support them, with the distance learning model?
So some degree, but still limited because of the way that the work year works. So, right, we've got teachers who will be wrapping their contractual school year this Wednesday, many of whom I know are tired and are looking for a summer to recharge their batteries. So we have had talk about continuing to build a virtual library where teachers can drop in and watch pre-recorded or packaged training pieces, particularly around the technical aspects of distance learning. But to a large degree, that's exactly why we want to make sure we move those professional development days to the front. I am concerned that the community, who was very understanding about closing schools on March 11th and opening the following Monday in a distance learning structure, realized that to a large degree, teachers were scrambling to make that shift. I'm worried that there's a perception that teachers have all summer long to now master this and really come up to speed, and we really don't. The contractual year for teachers with this schedule change will technically begin 4 days before the students return. Now, a lot of our teachers are going to put in more time than that, but we don't have 3 months to master this. We've got technically 4 days to plan and deliver really specific and targeted supports that will address whatever instructional set of challenges we have in front of us. And again, remember, we've got another conversation coming up. And so we're going to be balancing the concerns that we're hearing around equity and race with the instructional concerns that we have. And we're going to be working hard to address both of those. We're not picking. This is not an either or. This is a both and situation. So yes, there will be time, but it is limited. It's not 3 leisurely months to get ready.
Other questions or comments on this topic?
I thought, if I may, I also want to go back to, I noted graduation on Wednesday evening, but I did move across that pretty quickly. I do want to reiterate for the community that graduation, you know, in every year when we host a traditional graduation on the green, the event at the green is open to all comers, and seating is unlimited, and families, extended families, and the community at large are all welcome to attend. But every year we always plan for a rain event that would take place in the gymnasium if it were necessary. And that event is always very limited, and each senior only has the opportunity to invite 2 or 3 guests based on the size of the senior class. This year's event, while it doesn't look like it's going to be raining on Wednesday evening, is similar in that the fairgrounds are not open to the community or the public at large, and the seniors who are attending have the ability to bring family members who can fit in a family car with them. I do want to remind the community, however, that while we regret not being able to accommodate everybody at the fairgrounds, there will be a procession from the high school to the fairgrounds, progressing past the green on the way. And the community is encouraging community members, if they're comfortable to do so, to be out along that route and holding up signs and cheering our seniors along. I do need to remind the community that social distancing protocols are still in place. And so anybody who would like to come out to support our seniors are reminded to please wear a mask, to please keep social distancing, please keep 6 feet apart, and you should be with the family group with whom you are sheltering at this time. We really shouldn't be mixing in large social groups. And following the procession, when the actual graduation ceremony begins, it will be live simulcast to YouTube. And so you will be able to watch the ceremony and participate from a distance, even if you're unable to be in the fairgrounds with us. And we are sorry that we can't open the fairgrounds to the full community, but because of safety and health restrictions, we simply cannot. And I just wanted to reiterate those restrictions here tonight.
All right, thank you. The one, just last thing I'll say on this topic, it's just a reminder to all of us on the board and the administration that as the reopening plans come out, or as different ideas come out from the state, our representatives, our state representatives are available to us to hear from us. I spoke with Sean Scanlon yesterday, you know, who again extended the invitation. If there are things that we as a board or we as a school district are worried about in terms of reopening plans in the fall, things that we would like to communicate to him as one of our representatives. You know, I know Dr. Freeman has certainly connections with the State Department of Education and various groups that he is in constant contact with and discussion with as these plans unfold. But just wanted to reiterate Representative Scanlon's invitation as a reminder that he and our other reps are available to us in terms of hearing our concerns and feeding those back. All right. The second topic on the agenda tonight is Board of Ed discussion on racism and the GHS mascot. For the viewing public, just quickly let you know that in kind of the national experience that we are living right now, and the heightened awareness of race issues, of racism, of institutional racism, we have the Board of Ed and Guilford Public Administration received by my count, over 100 emails in the last week, week and a half, from present Guilford Public School students, from alumni of Guilford Public Schools, from parents, a former teacher. So a large group of folks connected with Guilford Public Schools. I will say, again, by my count, about 50% of these letters came from alumni of Guilford Public Schools who wanted to share their experiences post Guilford High School and then share their concerns about ways that we can think about these issues in Guilford Public Schools. About 35% were from parents and about 15% were from current students. So I'm going to start this by turning again this discussion to Dr. Freeman, but then open this up to a larger discussion of the board.
Dr. Balistrossi, I thought what I would do if I could, a number of those communications included a list of actions that the authors were asking that we engage in, and it was a fairly consistent list. I thought if I could, what I would do is really briefly comment on each of those actions, where we feel that we see ourselves now and what plans we have for moving forward. And I thought if I could, I would work my way from the bottom of the list to the top. One common suggestion was that we begin a community-wide conversation on the topic of race and systemic racism. I do want to first acknowledge that I agree with that as a needed action. That is something that we need to engage in. I will note that that is an effort that we have felt that we were beginning, but I think that we were beginning it slowly and thoughtfully, and I think that there is urgency to increasing the speed with which we're doing that. I do want to encourage anybody who is watching this meeting on Sunday evening with the weekly update of information that we distributed. We included a blog post by Dr. David Kirkland, and it is a definition of racism. He builds that definition on what he identifies as the 7 I's. I would encourage anybody who has not read that blog post to please do so. It is a very thoughtful and I think complete explanation of the complex topic of racism. And I think it's an important place that we can begin our community conversation. I do want to note again that we felt like we were wading into this conversation this year in December in conjunction with the Madison Public Schools and the Country School. Members of our community participated in an author conversation with Dr. Margaret Hagerman. She's the author of a book called White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. It was a positive evening, and I think it was a good foundation for a conversation to take place. I know at the high school that there was a group of students early this year who were motivated to begin tackling this conversation. There was a grassroots group of students who formed a climate committee and began meeting regularly at the high school with Mrs. Chaff, talking about topics around race and systemic racism in our community and in our schools. That group met collaboratively with a similar group of students from Daniel Hand High School. On March 11th, we had scheduled a public event to begin a community, well, I can't keep saying begin, but to continue that community conversation around understanding racism, religious intolerance, and prejudice. For that evening, we had scheduled speakers who would be joining us from the Connecticut Center for School Change, from the Anti-Defamation League, from True Colors, from the Health Education Center, a representative from the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, and an educational professor from the University of St. Joseph's. And we were very disappointed that that evening ended up needing to be canceled. We hope that it becomes postponed. We'd like to be able to return to that. This board had planned on scheduling a public hearing specifically around the topic of the mascot in April. Obviously, that has not occurred at this time. And I would, again, point the community to our website to look at the resources that we have attempted to continue to push out around this topic. But as I said, I think that there is an urgency around having that community conversation. And I think in large degree, that's what our agenda item tonight will have us discussing. What first steps and then what continuing steps will we need to take around that larger conversation? More specifically, there were requests in those communications about providing greater accountability and transparency around incidences of hate speech that occur in this community or in the schools specifically. And a number of them specifically called out the usage of the Confederate flag. I would remind this board that was it December? In December, this board revisited and updated our policies around behavior and around dress code to specifically call out incidences of hate speech or the use of imagery or iconography that could be considered hate speech. And the board specifically identified blackface, the use of the swastika, or the brandishing of the Confederate flag as examples of the type of speech that would not be tolerated in our schools. Additionally, I just want to remind the community that students are protected by FERPA. There are confidentiality concerns that are involved. And so while I absolutely agree with the position that we need to continue to educate around this type of communication, and we need to be careful about the kind of language that students are exposed to in our schools, the word transparency can at times be difficult when you are dealing with minors. And I just want to make sure that the community understands that we will always take an educational perspective while responding to these situations, and that we will always protect the confidentiality of all students, even ones who have transgressed, even ones who have made a mistake in their behaviors. Another item that was touched on was the idea of hiring a more diverse teaching staff. I again want to point out that that is exactly accurate. That is something that we need to do more work on, and that is something that we have been efforting and continue to effort moving forward. I do want to note that there is a nationwide and there is a statewide shortage of certified teachers of color in the state of Connecticut. Anecdotally, I know that a few years ago, Southern Connecticut State University was reporting an incoming freshman class that demographically was 40 or 44% minority. But the teaching program that year had enrolled 0 students of color into the teaching program. That is something that schools of higher ed are working on across the state of Connecticut. Back in 2011, the state of Connecticut Achievement Gap Task Force put out a position paper that noted the importance of growing that, that feeder system and bringing more teachers of color into the teaching ranks. I know that Mr. Bowden has been working on that with the statewide organization of HR administrators. UConn has been working on it. I know Southern has been working on it significantly. It continues to be a challenge, but it also continues to be one of the most important things that we can do, is to bring teachers and leaders of color into our community. And we continue to really focus on that. Another point that was hit was that we should complete comprehensive training for all teachers in the areas of culturally responsive instruction and race sensitivity. I again want to point out that I absolutely agree with that, and that will always be a work in progress. Last summer, the leadership team worked with Dr. Michael Moody on issues of race and equity during our summer retreat. Every leader in the school district has read either or both Waking Up White and White Fragility over the summer and into the beginning of this school year. All the leaders in the school district have been writing our own racial autobiographies. We hosted 3 faculty meetings this year with all teachers in the district to talk about issues of race and cultural sensitivity in the school system. Some of that was built on the work of Dr. David Kirkland. I mentioned him earlier. A number of the leaders in the district had the opportunity to work with Dr. Kirkland at the end of last school year. This year, we were building a series of faculty meetings on some of his work. We had scheduled a training with Dr. Don Seiler from the University of St. Joseph to work with all of our literacy coaches on culturally responsive instructional practices, particularly around the instruction of literature. That has had to be rescheduled into next school year, but we have continued to schedule with Dr. Seiler. A small number of our social studies teachers across the middle school and high school attended social studies teacher trainings that the ADL was providing. At the high school, we had scheduled a day of training with Tony Ferriello. That was to be training around gender identification and supporting the needs of our transgender students at the high school. That has been rescheduled into next year, but that is training at the high school that we continue to follow. We have ordered a copy of How to Be an Anti-Racist for every teacher in the school system. We're going to ask for that to be a summer read so that we can come back next year ready to have conversations about that important work. And just earlier today, I was in conversations with Dr. Sharon Locke. Sharon is the retiring superintendent from the Naugatuck School District. She is affiliated with UConn. She has done some exceptional work in the area of teacher training around issues of race and equity, and we're looking to build on some of Sharon's work as we move into next year. I just want to caution, however, that in some of the conversations I've had, some people seem to think that training around this topic can be done if we have one speaker come in for one day and put all of our teachers in the high school auditorium and talk at them or with them about being more culturally responsive. I just want to embrace this topic and let the community know that this is about who we are and how we do business. And while we may have made a start on this conversation, we will be doubling down on those efforts, but we will always be a work in progress. Just as we work on pedagogical training and instructional training every year, this needs to be something that we begin and continue to come back to. It is not a box that we will be able to check. So for people who have asked when we will complete this type of training, the answer is never. We've made a start. We need to do better at it. But it's not something that we're going to finish and put behind us. It's going to be something that we continue to work on. An additional suggestion was that we complete an equity audit. An equity audit would be looking at our curricula and looking at whether or not we feel the curricula are culturally responsive and balanced in a way that all students feel comfortable as they approach our curricula. We had a couple students this year who did a wonderful job meeting with the English department at the high school and drawing our adult attention to the diet of titles that we expose students to across their high school years. We are absolutely committed to completing a curricular audit. One of the audit tools that we are looking at is out of the Metropolitan Center from New York University. And again, that comes from David Kirkland's work. We are also in conversations with the Connecticut Center for School Change, looking at the possibility of inviting them in to support us in that audit. And we're having some conversations with, again, the University of St. Joseph's. There's a number of different models out there. There's a number of ways that you can look at conducting a self-study. You can look at having an outside facilitated study. We're not sure what route we're going to go, but I do want to say here tonight to the board and to the community that we are committed to completing an equity audit and looking at our curricula, not just in the titles that we teach in English language arts and not just at a few isolated social studies courses, but broadly. Again, this will be something that takes time. It's not going to be completed before we return to school. We're going to need to look at which model we want to use. We're going to need to look at bringing a group of folks together to work around that model, but it is something that we're absolutely committed to doing as we move forward. The last item that I want to touch on before I stop talking and let all of you talk again was the first item on most of the communications we received. Of the 100 some odd communications that Dr. Balistraci referenced, I think most or all of them started by calling for a discontinuation of the Guilford High School mascot, the Guilford Indian. I again just want to note that we had worked on beginning this conversation across this school year. We have compiled statements of positions from 4 tribal nations from Connecticut, 4 local tribal nations in Connecticut. Again, I want to note that this board had intended on scheduling a public hearing in April to continue that conversation. And I do want to note that across this school year on this topic, I met with a number of student groups to discuss this topic. I met with the Superintendent's Advisory, which is a group of local mental and physical health professionals to talk about this topic. I met with members of the Witness Stone organization. I met with members of the Dodd Foundation. I met with the Guilford Human Rights Commission. And I had met with an ad hoc group that had come together, facilitated by the Guilford Foundation, to talk about this topic. I am fully prepared to talk about the appropriateness of that mascot moving forward and what process we feel that we need to engage in if any decision is going to be made around the continuation or not of that Guilford mascot. I did reach out to UConn today. There's a professor at UConn who is affiliated with the Dodd Foundation, who has done quite a bit of work around this topic. And I was reaching out to see if he would be available to either engage in a conversation with you, the board, or help us think through a broader conversation if that's the way that we want to focus that. I again just want to note, you know, when we thought that we could open up our auditorium or our media center and invite the community in, we were ready to have that conversation. While I'm not suggesting that we will avoid this conversation as a result of COVID, I do want to acknowledge that the COVID crisis may change the shape of that conversation. We will, whatever conversation we have, will have to take into account health and safety concerns so that we can have the conversation in a way that is safe for this community to engage in. That was my sort of summary of the suggestions that came in those communications, and happy to continue the conversation in whatever way you want to continue it.
So I want to open this up to the board. There are a lot of points made there, a lot of places we can start. So really open to turning this over and seeing where people want to start.
Well, my concern, Paul, is educating the board and the community, right? I mean, there could be a decision made on the mascot issue very easily. I don't think that's going to educate people on the views of the mascot. So, you know, I know that, you know, obviously COVID had an immense impact on just how we move forward. And I'm hoping, I'm proposing that we could, you know, really quickly move forward on this originally slated, you know, community conversation that was slated for March 11th, and do that sooner rather than later, whether it's next week, a week after, whatever it would take to assemble that team of panelists, you know, again, because I think it is so important not only to just make a decision on the mascot, but to educate around the decision being made on the mascot. So I'm wondering if that is something that has been given thought to, if it's something we can move forward on, because I think it's immensely beneficial to everyone.
Yes, but I think we need to rethink that panel. The panel had been put together to address sort of a much broader conversation than focused on the up or down decision around the mascot. So, you know, Don Seiler, who sat on the panel, is an expert in culturally responsive instructional techniques. Margie Lipschitz Shapiro from the ADL was really ready to talk about religious tolerance. The speaker from True Colors was there to talk about gender and identity and sexuality concerns. I think that Professor Matoma from UConn might be the person who could join us for a conversation to focus more specifically on the history of Native American mascots and the position currently in Connecticut around the use of Native American mascots. I know that at this point, we're down to about 7 or 9 communities that still have a Native American mascot, while at one point there was a much larger number. I know that Glenn was intimately involved and familiar with the decisions that were made around this topic in Killingly earlier this year. And so I think that part of what we might want to do is to be a little more discreet and break some of these decisions off into smaller parts, because I think that this format is a little less wieldy than being together in a place and in a time. And so if it's all right with the board, I think that the first thing we should do is decide to have a conversation specifically about the mascot, recognizing that that's not all of a conversation about race and equity and cultural sensitivity in our community, but it can be viewed literally as symbolic of the rest of that conversation. And I think to say that for this specific evening, the board's going to talk with one expert, and I agree with you. Talk about why, like not just talk about we want everybody to know that there's going to be a yes or no decision, but to talk about why, the way, you know, what's behind choosing yes or no as a community, and somebody who can be really thoughtful and experienced and a little more emotionally distanced from a local decision, I think would be helpful. So yes, we put a lot of thought into it. And I think that if I can make contact, that we try to have that individual join. I mean, right, we've fallen into a schedule of an every Monday meeting. So I can work to try to have somebody able to join us next Monday, and if not, the Monday after, so that we can have that conversation before wrestling with making that decision. And then again, depending on how functional Zoom can be for the size audience that we draw, either the community at least gets to witness the board engaging in that conversation at a really thoughtful level, or has the opportunity to join into that conversation, at least to some degree, depending on how many people attend the meeting and how well the Zoom platform holds up under that condition.
I just wanted to make a quick couple of comments about the curriculum notes that we got in the email. And, you know, to your point about professional development and, you know, things that we can do as we start the school year in terms of, you know, education and bringing in experts, because I do, you know, we are always a work in progress, and I think we should always be a work in progress. You know, you talk about, you know, plan, do, study, act,
Yep.
and, you know, we want to make sure that we're always moving forward. And I want to make sure that we don't feel like we have to do something so quickly that we don't do it well. I don't think we should take a long time to do it. And I think we're all aware of the need to do something quicker. But when I was reading the emails and thinking about it, you know, it's a completely different issue, but I was reminded of the start time project.
Yes.
And while that took far longer than I hope that this will take to make some changes, we were very thoughtful about that. And we looked at it from a bunch of different angles. And, you know, we ultimately had a decision on it, but we didn't rush into it. And, you know, I think that, you know, to rush into this wouldn't be the best approach. We should, you know, start the process and, you know, just as you sort of described, but not to rush into it just to do something.
I really appreciate that comment. I know that the members of the leadership team on the call appreciate that comment. And I want to make clear that we're not, right, I am not in any way suggesting that we don't have the capacity or the bandwidth to begin talking about this because we have to focus on the COVID crisis first. I do, however, right, I can't undersell the fact that in large degree, we're going to be redesigning our instructional platform for September. It's not going to be the way schools looked on March 10th, and it's probably not going to be the way they've looked for these last 12 months. But I think there's an opportunity in acknowledging that we compare these two. They're not competing concerns. But if we need to redesign our school district, then we need to be thoughtful about redesigning the instructional platform and redesigning the way every student recognizes this school system. And does every student recognize the same opportunities and supports in this system as every other child? Now, that just means making time to do both of those things in tandem and thoughtfully, and that we're not going to be done. And so, right, to those commenters who wanted us to be able to say that we were going to address all of this before this school year ended, that simply isn't going to happen. And the idea that we're going to be able to do all of it in 4 days of stand and deliver work at the beginning of the school year, that also can't happen. But I do think that we can commit ourselves to both of those efforts and find ways to pair the pieces together and not pit them against each other. And so again, I just really appreciate the comment, and that's the way that we're trying to think about this work moving forward.
But there's a difference between rushing and urgency. And we won't, in the name of not rushing, we got to make sure that we maintain what I think is a legitimate demand for urgency. One of the beauties of the emails that we received is that most of the people treated this as a systemic problem. The problem itself is systemic with multiple variables, but also they understood that the solution was a system solution. There are 5 or 6 things, many of which you mentioned, that have to get done. There are a constellation of things. The cumulative effect will make a difference. If you think of it as an iceberg, there's some very visible things like the mascot that are all linked and they're all floating out there. And you can easily deal with the mascot question in a very urgent sense, as long as people can understand that we're linking it to these other systemic problems, and that tackling that doesn't mean that we can tackle with the same timeline, redoing the entire curriculum and engaging in teachers learning new pedagogy, not to mention that we got to change reward systems and accountability around those things. And how do you measure whether or not we're making a difference with students? If we did this well from K through 12 at the curricular level, and teachers were teaching differently and weren't causing some students to suffer what students perceive they're suffering in terms of their classrooms, how would we know? How would it compare to what we're doing now? That part of that's the audit. So I would argue that we don't need a lot of outside experts to help us on some of these issues. There's a lot of expertise, not only in our own staff, but there are a lot of people in this community who are well-trained, have studied this, we can make use of, and avail ourselves of people who have given this a lot of thought. One of the things I was thinking is some of these emails, some sample of them, are so eloquent and so well-reasoned that it would be good if a lot of people in the community were able to read them. One, to hear the voices of people who are concerned, but also about the depth and extent to which people bring to this, not just an emotional appeal, but a well-reasoned, thoughtful, systemic approach that the more you read them and hear them, the more it seems to me one gets a consensus about a roadmap. And that I worry that some of what we're saying tonight sounds a little pedantic and academic in the usual, let's have in-service and let's do this. And the spirit of what we're hearing is enough is enough. We've done this for 200 years, and that doesn't mean we can jump, as you said, but there's got to be some medium point here where we can be urgent and at the same time comprehensive.
Agreed.
I just want to kind of fishtail on that, Dick. You know, I took some time today just to kind of go back to our curriculum and just see, you know, I went through the social studies history curriculum just to see where, you know, we have opportunities to enrich that and add to what we've all been talking about today. And there's wonderful opportunities. We have a really great framework for that. But that's something that everyone, I think, agrees is we need to give educated time and thought to, and not just rush to make changes. But I agree with you that the mascot is something that we can, as a community, hopefully come to a pretty quick consensus about. And like you said, given the emails, the input we've received, those are the people who are taking action. And sometimes it's unfortunate that those that we don't hear from have just allowed a voice, right? And when we brought this to the community before, there's pushback, but I don't think we're at that point anymore. And I think it'd be very helpful to put some priority to it. I know it's going to be a complicated semantic thing, you know, uniforms and whatnot, but we're smart people. We can figure that part out. But I you know, I agree on both points you just made. So thank you for speaking probably more eloquently than me.
There was something really poignant in a number of the recent graduates' communications to talk about how proud they were to go off to university or to go to a more metropolitan area or to go overseas wearing their Guilford Indians regalia, and then finding out in short order that they were not comfortable wearing any of that iconography or spirit wear at their school or in that metropolitan center or wherever they were overseas, and they stopped wearing it because they began to feel uncomfortable wearing that. And that is an experience, that's an anecdote that I agree needs to be shared, to John's point, when we talk about why we're asking this question, and we talk about the educational pieces behind deciding whether or not we're going to continue that mascot or not. There was a surprising number of communications that shared that type of story in different locations. And I agree that to have some of those commenters share their story in person in this meeting, or at least allow me to read their communications to the public, I think is going to be an important part of that conversation. And to the points being made, addressing any one of these 5 suggestions is not going to then allow us to check a box and just move on. I agree that these are interconnected, and one relies on the others, and most of them are not simple decisions that we can make and put behind us. They will be investments that we will need to continue to monitor and invest in over some time. And again, I'm not suggesting that we're going to wait until everything goes back to normal to begin this work. I am just trying to call out that the end date is going to be harder to identify than acknowledging that there is a commitment to begin or double down on this work in the way that it was identified in a lot of these communications.
Paul, I really was just wanting to know, how do you see right now, what do you see as the process that needs to happen to make a decision about the mascot? I know you had a pretty clear sense of the type of community talks that needed to happen. Many of them couldn't happen due to COVID. What is your sense now of what the process needs to be? I as everybody else, was really touched by all the communication that we got, and in particular, the individuals who communicated about their changed feelings about the mascot going off to college and things like that. We've heard, a lot of more different communication now than we had, a couple months ago when we had in mind a different process. What do you think we need to do going forward here?
I think the first step is that we need to schedule a conversation as a Board of Education, right? So when we talked about this meeting last week, we sort of made it clear that we wanted to talk about process moving forward. I do think that in order to make this manageable, we need to break some of these pieces off. I think that we need to schedule a specific time to talk about the mascot and just the mascot component. I think at that time, I need to share with the board and the community some of the positions that we've been collecting. We've got a position from the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, from the Mohegan tribe, from the Nipmuc tribe, from the Eastern Pequot tribe, as well as positions from the American Psychological Association and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I think to have somebody who is more expert in this specific topic to help us be part of that conversation would be important as well. I think that that conversation has to happen at least among the board members in front of the community, and to the degree possible, community members need to have the opportunity to engage in that conversation. Although to your point about the changing tone and tenor of the communications that we're receiving, I think a lot of the education around this topic has taken place outside of Guilford Public Schools since Memorial Day. I think that the conversations that have been taking place at a national level around race and systemic racism have led a number of members of our community to have an opinion on this topic, where either before they felt unengaged with this topic, or maybe an opinion that has evolved for them. I was really hesitant earlier in the school year to make a decision on this, feeling that it would be surprising to the community, feeling that there were going to be a number of community members who wanted to know why the mascot conversation was coming up again and why it was important. I'm less concerned about that. I think that issues of race and identity and systemic racism have been raised and interrogated over the last 2 or 3 weeks in a way that they had not been at a national level for a long time. And so to the point about urgency and breaking off individual pieces of this, I think that we schedule a meeting for the board. I think that the board engages in the why behind why this is an important question pretty deeply. And then the board decides, what do we want to do next? Do we want to move to a decision-making phase, or do we want to open up for broader public comment or commentary or communication? But I think that we take the first step and then we decide after that. And I'm hopeful that I can have that conversation structured either for next Monday or the Monday after, depending on the response that I get from Dr. Matoma. I just, as we were talking, got a response back from a colleague that thought if Glenn's available, he'd be very happy to be part of this conversation. So I will make that connection tomorrow and keep the board apprised. I do think that we need to unpack publicly why this is an important decision to make for us, and then decide on how much time it will take or what process is involved in making that decision. I will note for the community watching that I have taken this position with the board before, that while the board has the authority to make any decision that the board chooses, we do have 7 school mascots. Every school in this, right, we do not have a Guilford. The Guilford Indian is not the community, it is the Guilford High School Indian. And while it doesn't have a caricatured mascot that is associated with it, it is a nickname, it is a moniker that we have held on to at the high school. It is only at the high school. The board hasn't officially taken action on the Cox Coyote or the Leet Lion or the Baldwin Bulldog. So I do believe that it is a decision that can be made at the school and at the district level, but I want the community to, again, to John's point, I want the community to understand the why behind it. And I want there to be a thoughtful, educational conversation about why this is an important decision before any decision gets made and publicized with the community.
Thank you, Paul. The position statements that you've collected, are those available to look at for the community?
I can certainly share them with the board. We had intended on publishing those on March 11th during the event that we were scheduling. We just have samplings. You know, we have essentially we have the core of each of those on a 1-page handout. I will distribute that. I'll send that out to all the board members as soon as I log off from this conversation tonight.
I think the last several weeks have simply brought to a head what we would now call a teachable moment, and that for the nation, one. Number two, our school system is not unique in having to face these problems. There's very few school systems in this country that do justice to the issues that we're facing. So that, not that that's an excuse, it's to simply say that we're just part of the larger culture. But essentially almost all schools, particularly suburban schools, have been complicit in the institutional racism of this country, which means that if we don't deal with the issue, we're just more guilty than before. But the whole notion that we're now starting this, we do have a roadmap, and that roadmap in part has been well articulated in these emails. I'm just so impressed with how well the arguments were made by students, parents, community members, and alums, that they are teaching devices. You cannot read those and not come away different than if you didn't read them. It seems to me it's a wonderful context for appreciating how people themselves have learned in the milieu of what we're going through now. And just the very reading that, and we can easily share those without, if nobody wants their name on it.
Exactly right.
They don't need the names, number one, but they were sent to us publicly in the first place. So I don't think they were meant to be confidential. But there's ways of doing that. So for example, if some of our high school students, where we read some of the things that were written, particularly the personal stories of former students, not to mention current students who are telling us what they've suffered as current students. That's educative, one. Two, if the teachers K through 12 read these, it would perhaps give them an understanding differently than any of us or an expert could say about the perception of each of those constituent groups that have not been articulated before, and gives context for then the next conversation, which is why we need to do an audit. There are various ways of doing an audit. We could just ask teachers tomorrow, K through 12, send us the examples of the way in which in your classrooms, in every subject, you believe you are engaging in the kind of teaching that purposefully and effectively instructs people on these issues. And that would be interesting to compare that with some external person doing the audit, or a group of teachers doing it. How do we have wonderful examples already in the school system that then become exemplars as part of our growing? So I'm just saying, how do we take advantage of the power, some of it explanatory power, of what we've seen in the last week, and instead of sort of build on and trade on it as a teaching device? It's text material, and I think it was very instructive, and it's more than intellectual. People wrote heartfelt things in a way that as you read them, you feel them the same way that they were meant. I think I have a faith that a lot of people would see those things and say, now I know what we're talking about. And I'm glad I didn't have to reveal myself publicly before I read these things.
I think we could absolutely build that into the conversation. Yes, the way that we shape this next conversation around the mascot specifically.
Yes.
And then continuing the work moving forward.
I'm a little concerned about how I too was very moved by the perspective that especially the former students, the alumni, brought to this question. But I remember that we've been discussing this for a while, and that there are people in town who feel very strongly that the mascot should remain as it is. Now, part of this is that people don't like change, but and I'm concerned in this environment where we're forced to use something like Zoom, which has a lot of wonderful qualities, but it's not the same as a large public meeting in trying to get everybody who has an opinion a chance to express their views. And So I wonder how we could do this so that the people who have in the past expressed reservations about making these changes don't feel that we have somehow railroaded them or ignored them. I just, I think we need to find some mechanism to do that. And I haven't personally had a lot of luck with large Zoom calls.
I absolutely understand the concern. To some degrees, I share the concern, but I do know that a number of the communications, when they specifically talked about the open public conversation, were specifically saying, please don't lose this opportunity by waiting until we come back to normal. And so and again, I think that we have to balance the idea of having both and recognizing the challenges that this time presents, but to your point, finding a vehicle that allows us to have the conversation. And I think, again, to the points that have been made earlier, that we share some of the stories we've heard and we have some of the why conversation first, and then allow a vehicle for people to comment rather than opening it up for comment first and then education. Because I do think that if we discuss the why, and I think if we share the position of the tribal nations first, I think that a lot of the wonders or questions that people may have may be answered by doing some of that in a thoughtful way, and then still providing an opportunity either through writing or through a comment period or through what may be a laborious Zoom process, but making sure that people have an opportunity to express an opinion if they choose to before that change gets made. Again, I do think that some of what I was struggling with around educating around these sorts of topics, we are seeing play out in other related conversations around statuary, around NASCAR events. We're seeing related conversations that are happening at a national level. And I think they're clear analogs to the conversation of a high school mascot. So I think some of that work is being done in a much broader audience than the Guilford High School. But I think we can leverage that and work from that, not ignore it and not eliminate the opportunity for people to express an opinion if they need to or choose to. And right, that the ability to comment when you have a comment is illustrated by the 100 emails that we have all received on this topic. So for folks who may be watching tonight, you know, there was a healthy conversation in social media that I monitored, right? This has been a conversation. I've had meetings in my office about the history of the mascot. I do think it's important. I will note here that Guilford Public Schools have been an educational entity for 140 years. We have been the Indians for the last 70 of those years at Guilford High School. Prior to that, Guilford High School were the Rams. And again, I want to note that while I know there may be some sense that this is a community moniker, it is the Guilford High School Indian. I want to make that abundantly clear. It is not the Adams Indian or the Baldwin Indian or the Cox Indian. It's only at the high school. And so I do want to try to contextualize this decision as well. I'm not saying that to minimize the importance of it, but I'm saying that to size it properly. But I agree that we need to think about how we provide that opportunity and encourage people to take advantage of that opportunity.
You know, I would like to say that I agree that Zoom is a different format than an in-person, but that what is happening around the country, what is spurring on these emails to us, the sense of urgency from these emails suggests that we need to make this work in the current environment that we're in. I do think there's an important opportunity to educate, and there are plenty of documents, and Dr. Freeman noted these letters from tribal nations. I mean, we have, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission wrote about this in 2001. There are many, many ways in which we can share what we know from those around us who have done really careful and thoughtful work in this area, and then try to move this forward. I know from the emails that we received that some folks are really frustrated because this is not the first time this has come up. I've been on the board for 8 years. This is not the first time that this has come up. Guilford has a very complicated relationship with this mascot. There are many who feel that we are in some form or another honoring our history with this mascot. There are others of us who understand that that people feel that way, but we feel differently. So I think there are really opportunities here to open up a discussion that is informed by what folks have shared with us, much as Dr. Hirsch was talking. I think, one of the things that really struck me this time around, and I'm saying that on purpose because I know this is not the first time this has come up. What really struck me this time around is the large number of alumni who said while they were in Guilford Public Schools, they did not necessarily recognize what the mascot stood for in a way that they did once they left this community and entered much more diverse communities, whether those were college communities, urban communities, a variety of communities across the country. And many of them spoke very eloquently about what that felt like to start to recognize that perhaps the Guilford Indian sweatshirt they were wearing, or the baseball hat, really kind of struck some really awkward encounters. I heard the word embarrassed. I read the word embarrassed in emails. I read the word of just really feeling like they were unprepared. And so I think we have more work to do. We most certainly have more work to do. And so I would encourage that we do a thorough job, but that we utilize the technology we have around us to make this happen, to make this conversation happen, to make this education happen, to really move this issue forward.
I'd just like to add that a number of the communications we received, or in some cases, it was a follow-on communication after I had responded. A number of the communications wanted to know if there was going to be a commitment and a timeline associated with the suggestions that were made. So let me say here, as clearly as possible, there's not a bad suggestion on that list. Those are all ideas that are worthy of time and consideration and investment. And we are committed to working on every single one of those. As far as a timeline goes, I again want to suggest we had recognized the import of several of those, if not the urgency, and the urgency has been increased over these last several weeks. The only caution that I want to voice is that all of this work would have been challenging and emotional under the best of circumstances. And I want to acknowledge that we will be engaging with it, and we will be engaging with it not under the best of circumstances. We will be engaging it while we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And I don't say that as an excuse. I just want to label that. And I want to make clear that my goal will be to marry those two concerns, not to allow those two concerns to compete with each other. So if the authors of those communications are looking for a commitment You have it. You have it tonight from me in this meeting. I'm watching heads nod and hearing the board members acknowledging that this is work that needs to be done. But I again want to point out that there will be issues of capacity and bandwidth and timing as we also figure out what schools will look like in September. And I do believe there's an opportunity to think about reimagining and redesigning school on two hands. And we're not going to choose one or the other. We're going to focus on both. And again, just wanted to make sure that that came out as clearly as possible. In the beginning of this conversation, I wanted to take some time to walk through each and to identify what I saw as work completed and opportunity to move forward. I want to finish by just summarizing that this is important work and we are committed to engaging with it. I see that and hear that commitment from you, the board, and I want the community to hear that commitment from me, the superintendent.
Other thoughts, comments?
So I'll just add then specifically to the 9 of you, I appreciate your support and your energy during all of this. I've said to many of you separately, I heard a commentator recently point out that we're currently living through the 1918 pandemic, the 1930s financial crash, and the 1960s civil unrest all at the same time. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate you, the board, being here to support us and to help the relationship between us, the schools, and the broader Guilford community during this very, very challenging, stressful, emotional time for all of us. It means a lot that you are here encouraging us, supporting us, and pushing us on these important topics. I said to the teachers, I couldn't think of a better team to be working with. I want you to know that I feel the same about the board and very much appreciate the way that you're helping us to address these issues. I'm hoping that we don't have a fourth item to add to our plate moving forward, that the pandemic, the financial challenges, and that the important conversations around race and relationship and equity, that we can handle these and move forward and not add yet another challenge to our plate right now. The staff and the leadership here in the district have been exemplary, and I know that they will rise to these challenges as well.
My sense is, Paul, the good news is that I think the writers of these letters were most concerned about whether or not, one, there was a commitment. You've made that clear. Two, would it be done with some sense of urgency without necessarily using the word immediately? It seems to me that that's a commitment. It may never go as quickly as any of us or they would like, but we know it's going to be monitored. If we haven't done anything in the next 2 years, we're going to hear about it in any case, and it wouldn't be justified. But I think people listening today would be appreciative of the fact that they've been heard, they've been agreed with. We're going to move forward in the context that you've created, that's fair. Further, I think that if we ask for their help, their individual expertise, their moral support, maybe really large monetary contributions, that people will be quite supportive because they'll be pleased that this is going to be addressed head on, I think, with courage. And that I heard that's the spirit I think they were questioning. I don't think there will be any more I don't think they'll have an ability to question it so easily in the future if they listen tonight.
I'd also like to note, as much as we are struggling with how to hear from the public, and we are being very conscious about making sure that we're allowing the public to comment, out of all of the multitude of emails that we received, many of them were from people who are not local at all. You know, we heard from folks in LA, we heard from folks in New York City, we heard from folks from Providence, Rhode Island. So if we had a public hearing, they wouldn't have been able to attend. So I think we can get the work done in what we're given. I think that they actually did a great job at getting us nice, concise, putting together thoughtful approaches to this that were very digestible. We really clearly understood what everybody wanted. So I think we can get it done. I'm going to suggest that Paul, I really liked what you had to say about there never being a deadline. We're never going to finish this work. I think that's the right way to think about it with regard to curriculum, but not necessarily with the mascot. So I'm wondering what you guys think about putting a deadline on coming up with a timeline for this board to make a decision about the mascot. Do you think that we should try to say, here's the plan, and of course we can amend it if it doesn't work, but maybe give ourselves 4 weeks where we've got a meeting next week to maybe have a guest speaker, allow us some time to put public announcements out so folks can comment if they want to, but really hold ourselves to a deadline. What do you guys think of that idea?
I'm for it, Kristen. I think that's what's missing here. I think it's one thing to say that there's urgency behind this and there's a commitment to it. We need to show it. And I think that's what's really important here. I think, establishing a way for the community, again, to hear perspectives, to be educated on the subject is so important. But the next step is what's even more important. So I do think that is the one thing that's missing from our discussion tonight is committing to a timeline.
So just to clarify, what are you proposing? Are you proposing that we set a timeline as a board to make a recommendation? Because Paul, makes the point that the decision is in sort of the administration's hands here. So is that what you're recommending, that the board make a make a recommendation in a timely fashion?
And you could certainly give me a timeline. You could task me with having a decision on this topic to the board before the end of July, right? And that I understand that the board doesn't want me to go away, not think about this, and come back with a decision at the end of July, but that in the interim, there needs to be education and discussion, at least in the public eye, if not with the public. And we've heard suggestions about bringing in an expert, sharing the positions that we've curated, and looking into sharing some of the communications that we've most recently collected. I mean, you could absolutely, again, right? There's no history in how the mascots came to be. I can't find board minutes from 70 years ago to clearly tell you whether the board took action or not in naming that mascot. I do know that the board has not officially endorsed or named all 7 mascots at all 7 of our schools. So I'm happy, in the shape that we've laid out, to say that this is a school level and administrative level decision, but clearly we're not thinking about making a decision without including the board and the community in the work that leads to that decision. And I think that it's more than fair if the board wants to say, Paul, there needs to be some response to this by a date certain.
So what would be a good date for you so that you're not rushed, so that there's urgency, but that you would clearly, this ought to be a decision ideally where the board and the superintendent and the administration are on the same page. Those are always the best decisions. But what would it take for you to feel that you can do justice to this with all the variables that a superintendent has to worry about that we may not be aware of, that is fair to your people, school people, and the community? It may not be July, it could be August, it could be sooner, but do you have any sense of that order of magnitude? You want to, well, you can tell us next week. You can say, I've thought about it, and when we meet next meet, you can say, I thought
I think that would be helpful. Yes, that would be helpful if we could sort of try to sketch out a calendar and think about what that looks like. I think that there will be, yes, I can do that by next week.
I think also that, however, that we should clarify one thing. I think that the program should be that we become more educated on this, that we try and share this educational points with the community, we get as much input as we can and all that. But I think we need to have a recommendation from the leadership team as to what we should do on the mascot. But I think that the final decision should be with the board.
I'm gonna suggest that I think there's room. I think there's room for both the administration and the board to make their feelings clear here about this issue. You know, I think there are many of us who, and I know that's not coming across necessarily to our listeners last night, because what we're talking tonight about is process. But there are many on the board who feel really quite strongly about this. And so I think I think what we can do is create a process here by which the administration can provide us with kind of their thoughtful consideration on this, and the board likewise can share their feelings as well. It seems to me that there is room for, and I think it's going to be important for our community to hear both from the administration, who has been working on this topic, whether it's with the panel discussions, student discussions, teacher kind of instruction through books, etc. This is again a topic, as we've talked about tonight, that has to continue, that has to increase. But I think there's room for all of our voices here, and I think we need to hear both from the administration and from the board on this issue.
And I think we have even kind of two questions that perhaps Dr. Freeman can come back to us with. Like, the first question that needs to get answered is, are we going to change the mascot or not? And I think, we can collectively come up with a yes or no to that. And then the second question is, if we in fact decide that we are going to change the mascot, what do we change it to? And I feel like that second question is where we're going to wind up wanting public feedback. I feel like the kids at the high school are going to really want to have a stake in what the mascot's going to be. So I think maybe this becomes almost like a two-step decision. Like, maybe Dr. Freeman can come to us, with a deadline over the next couple of weeks saying yes or no. Yes, we want to change it. And then from there, we come up with another process to figure out, how do we get to hear from the students and from the community about to what we'd like it to change. What do you guys think of that? Do you think that that's the right way to go, rather than just expect Paul to come to us with a soup to nuts type solution?
That's absolutely the way that I have always been thinking about this. The first thing that we need to discuss and decide on is the appropriateness of the current mascot. If there's a decision made to move away from the current mascot, then I have always envisioned a process that would allow for broad community nomination of some possibilities, and then ultimately a student vote on a palette of those nominated suggestions. I want to make it very clear that I have no interest in removing the Indian and naming the next mascot. That should be a decision that is open, again, to a broad nominating process from anybody, and then a palette of suggestions that is laid out for students to vote on, and whether that is high school students or future high school students, right? But I absolutely think that process will be inclusive and will be detailed after a decision is made about the existing mascot. I have no interest in picking anything that may come next, and I don't think that this board does, and I'll venture to say, or should. I think that should absolutely be a student decision that gets made moving forward, if it's necessary.
As we think about it, and Paul, it sounds like you've been asked to kind of think about a timeline. I would like to make sure that we provide kind of opportunity for for discussion here. I'm going to simply share that that I'd like to not wait 4 or 5 weeks for this board to have a discussion on this topic.
No.
As I said again, I know at least some of us have pretty strong feelings about this already, and would really like the opportunity to have that conversation. So I would like to make sure that we really think about how to have a board discussion around this, not usurping anyone's individual decision-making power, but to kind of find ways to do that sooner rather than later.
I have a quick question to bring up. After hearing everyone talk this evening, is there an option or a way that we could decide to suspend the high school mascot until we do come up with a decision, whether we're going to keep it or change it or what have you, until we can go through the process, like Dr. Friedman said earlier about having the experts come in and educate the town? I mean, suspending it is what's the harm for now until we come up with a more concrete decision?
Logistically, unless there's a replacement, we have an issue about a gym floor that's currently painted. We have uniforms that bear the moniker, right? And to suspend it would essentially be to continue the existing mascot, right? Unless we ended up buying new uniforms that said nothing on it. And again, it has connections to the way we label ourselves, the imagery we use, the iconography we use. There's a whole branding component that goes along with it. So unless we were to remove the existing branding and replace it with blanks and then make a decision later and again, this speaks to some of the frustration I heard in the communications. To delay a decision is to continue the use of the Indian mascot. And that's some of the frustration that I read through some of the communications.
Yeah, it violates the notion of urgency, and it also appears, to some at least, as kicking the can down the road. Even if that's not the intent, that's not a message that I think we want to convey.
Well, I mean, I think that's why it's important to have a very clear timeline with very clear time points about when decisions or announcements, we'll call them, will be made.
Mm-hmm.
I think that goes a long way to help people recognize that there's going to be a progression.
I think to the point about urgency, I worry about establishing a timeline because I'm being cautious or conservative that ends up being longer than it needs to be. There's a part of me that's very concerned that if we have a really knowledgeable guest next week and we have an in-depth conversation, that this board may feel that they know everything they need to know to have a decision made relatively soon. And I worry that if we say, middle of August, that we're again then sort of kicking the can down the road unnecessarily. Why don't we see what the conversation next week brings and then commit to a timeline or discuss a timeline on the heels of that conversation?
Or you simply say no later, this will be decided.
Yeah, no later than is,
sort of a stop loss thing. And if we get it done if we say we're going to give ourselves 6 weeks and we do it in 3, all the better. But at least people will know there's an end point.
Dr. Freeman, if we decide to change it, is that something that can take effect for this coming school year? Like what you're talking about, having to change uniforms in the gym floor, that sounds like, I know uniforms for the kids need to get ordered a few months in advance in order to make it if we have fall sports. So is it the kind of thing that even if we make a decision within the next 2 weeks, will we have enough time to try to implement the change before the school year if in fact we make a change?
No, probably not. There will definitely be a transitional phase, and there will be there will also be And I know this is an important question. We do know that there will be a cost associated with rebranding a school. And so if we have a new mascot, it involves sanding and painting a gym floor, it involves changing uniforms. There will be a financial cost involved in that. There will be a phase in, right? Depending on when a decision gets made, will there be time to get fall uniforms ordered and delivered within that time frame? We know that we will have spirit wear throughout this community that exists. I also want to make it clear that if there's a change and if this school moves forward, there won't be an effort to go back in time and erase the history. We will not go into our high school and remove 70 years worth of yearbooks that have the old mascot or old imagery on it. We'll simply acknowledge that there's a change and we'll move forward from that change. So there might be a time of overlap where fall sports may not be able to be updated. I also know that the new imagery isn't all of a sudden going to appear complete and done. There's always a growing into period for new, even schools and organizations that have existing mascots change and update those mascots. There was a big uproar at UConn just over changing the look of they're still the Huskies, but boy, going from the white smiling one to the black and red aggressive looking one was a big deal for some people. There will be a time of transition and change, and no, it won't be like ending one NFL season and starting a new one with a new look, and it'll be implemented over time, and the cost may need to be absorbed over time, especially going into what's probably going to be an unsettled financial year for the school system. There have been suggestions, and I did hear one board member even reiterate those. There have been suggestions when this conversation has come up in the past that the community might want to engage in some fundraising to help offset the expense of rebranding the school if it's a decision that gets made. And so we can look into the idea of doing some fundraising. We can look into those ideas. But no, it won't happen immediately. There will be some overlap if that happens.
Well,
I do think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Moira. No, go ahead.
What I was saying is, it's clear through the communications we've received by email, and it was brought to my attention that my phone number is incorrectly listed on the website, so I will have that changed.
Oh.
But that there's large community support clearly in terms of this mascot, but we can't make that assumption here in this very moment. But I would garner to say that that's hopefully what we'll learn, right? That we have a community in support of looking at this mascot and making significant changes. And I believe me, as a board member, I recognize that we are probably headed into a very dicey season of costs for us, as a district. But I also suspect we have a very generous community. When there's been anything that's been needed in this community is amazing. It's why my husband and I chose to raise our kids here. Cost of uniforms and things like that, I can imagine that no community member would want to hear that as a reason why we don't act on something. And I know it's not what you implied at all, but
thank you.
I would suspect that if we can get through this process, and I know for many out there listening and watching, there's a term painful to it, but we are an elected board and we're trying to be thoughtful towards every opinion out there. We understand where the majority probably lies with this. And I'm excited that we are going to put some timeline towards this. And you have to, as a superintendent, recognize cost implications and budget implications. But I think right now this is very emotional. And I feel most people in our community are feeling a need to have a call to action, to feel purposeful in some way in moving the needle away from, any sort of reference to being being against equality for anybody. And I just, I think the mascot is kind of that live wire that we need to talk about sooner than later, like we've all discussed, but I just wanted to put that out there.
I mean, I want to make clear, I can't imagine that we're going to make this decision based on costs. And I know that's not what Mrs. Peck was asking. and I know what this discussion is about, we are quite clear what this is about, right? I mean, this is about considerations of racism, of systemic racism. This is considerations about kind of the health and safety of well-being of the students in our district, white and students of color. These are really, really, really important issues that we are addressing here. Cost is one we will have to consider as changes are made, but it is certainly not what this decision is about. And in no way are we going to be making a decision of this importance on cost. We will figure that out. I can only imagine, given the strength and the urgency of the emails we've been receiving, that we have a large community behind any changes we make, who are going to support, help support, fundraise, et cetera, to help make this happen.
And I agree. And thanks, Katie, for pointing that out, because I do think what Kristen's point was that, at least how I understand it, is that, it's important for us as the board to have a timeline for our next discussion about this, but that pending a decision, we would just ask that there's some patience in the community, as it will be a process to make a potential change.
Any other thoughts at the moment?
I think the only thing that I would want to kind of clear up is, we've talked about timelines. I can't stress enough just how urgent this is, that we decide on a path forward here. We've heard 6 weeks, we've heard 3 weeks. Paul, do you think it's possible that we move forward with a discussion next week? And then how soon after that can you be coming to us with a recommendation?
So I am hopeful that we can have that educational conversation we talked of as soon as next week. I'm going to make every effort to be able to have somebody here to join us. I can certainly update you next week on where we are. And I'm hoping to have somebody who's more expert in these conversations than me to join in that conversation. I think then the only issue for me is going to be, to what degree and for how long and in what way will we open a window or a vehicle for public commentary on that conversation? I think there's, I think that there's an outside possibility that if we have a really productive conversation and there is the ability to open the Zoom meeting to public comment next week, that I could be ready to take the next step as soon as next week. I think that's highly unlikely. I think that there's going to need to be some conversation about what that vehicle for public comment looks like and how long that window needs to stay open. And I think that will be the primary controlling factor on whether it's 6 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week, in order to come to a point that we're ready to make a decision in whichever way we choose to make the decision, whether it's administrative or board level. But I think that we simply, so yes, we can have some degree of conversation next week. How deep and effective that conversation can be is only going to be controlled by my ability to have that guest educator join us, and by to what degree do we want to open up that window for public commentary. So I think that I'll work on that, and I think that by this time next week we'll know, are we gonna, I mean, we'll have that answer. I just don't feel ready to answer that now, in part because of, again, the limitations that technology is placing on us. I recognize that to some degree there are limitations. To other degrees, it's It's the technology that afforded our recent graduates the ability to comment on this from wherever they are. Those people who commented from New York City and from California and from Denmark are all Guilford kids who have traveled to these other places. So I think it's just that is going to be the controlling factor. How do we allow for that commentary, and how long do we allow for that commentary? That's the only piece that I think is going to drive how long that window has to be open.
But we're talking weeks, not months. I mean,
absolutely.
If we have our meeting next week and it gets reported in the local paper, and we agree on another meeting via Zoom for the community, you got to have some time for the community to learn that there's going to be a meeting and to learn what's been discussed so far, so that it's a real open meeting. But that's only a few weeks. So to John's concern, it sounds to me that we're really talking about a relatively narrow window of time compared to where we were when we started the meeting tonight.
Yeah, agreed. We're moving in the right direction, Dick, without question. You know, I think we all want to put this conversation to bed, right? You know, we all want to move forward on this, and yeah, I'd feel comfortable saying 3 weeks max. I don't know if the rest of the board is comfortable on that, or if Paul, you're willing to commit to that. I want to see this conversation move forward swiftly, and quite honestly, I think if we had a community discussion in a week, and left it open for a week of comment, it would provide all of us enough information gathering, or to hear from everyone on their views that we need.
I don't disagree with that assessment.
Other thoughts? All right. So it sounds like we have a plan, hopefully, for moving forward on all these issues, whether we're talking about the curricular issues, which we recognize will take more time, on a mascot issue for which we feel some urgency to move forward rather quickly. Certainly, we're hearing that urgency from those who have reached out to us thus far. So it sounds like we definitely have some action steps there. The next item on the agenda is an executive session. This is an executive session for the board to discuss Dr. Freeman's evaluation and contract. When we come out of executive session, there will be no votes, no further discussion. So what we will do now is head into that executive session. Before I do that, I do want to say to the viewing public, thank you to those of you who have reached out to us thus far. I have read every single email that has come to us, as I believe my colleagues have done as well. Because while, as Dr. Freeman noted, there were some common themes and common requests, each of you shared your individual either stories or views or experiences, and it was really important to read everyone. I will say to those of you who have not reached out to us, our emails are available. Please feel free. That's what we are here for. And I look forward then to our meeting next week. Oh, sorry, Mrs. Sullivan.
That's okay. I forgot to say before, yes, reach out via email. And similar to Moira, my phone number is not correct on the website. We recently made some changes to a cable company, and I don't have that phone number anymore. So I will update that, but feel free to reach out with email.
Yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out by phone. And again, my apologies to whoever did try to reach me by phone. I wasn't aware. Same thing with Amy, change servers, and it'll be updated hopefully by tomorrow.
All right. So I am going to ask for a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Mrs. Sullivan, a second. Dr. Best, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, so I'm going to thank the administrators that were on the call with us tonight. Appreciate your presence. Thank the viewing public for your interest and your continued engagement. We will again go into executive session at this time.